Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Yesterday's devastating violence in Bangalore raises an unavoidable question. Was the situation mishandled by the Karnataka government? The fact that Bangalore was peaceful today, paradoxically, underlines that concern for many people. Did the government anticipate the trouble? Did it respond by taking necessary advance measures? And if it did, why was the worst violence at 7 at night, 6 hours after the Supreme Court order and after Section 144 had been declared? Those are the questions we shall tackle today, when we will also examine some of the conspiracy theories and the impact on Bangalore's image. My guests are one of Karnataka's former leading police officers, Gopal Hosur, who joins us in a moment, the chairman of the Hindu group, N. Ram, the working president of the Karnataka Pradesh Congress Party, Dinesh Gundu Rao, and the chairperson and managing director of Biocon, Kiran Mozumdar Shaw. Mrs. Shaw, given that Karnataka was peaceful, though tense today, many people believe this alone proves that the state government yesterday failed to take effective steps to handle the situation. As a non-political observer, but someone who was there when it all happened, do you agree with that opinion?
Well, I would say that they were taken unawares. I think they were not in a state of readiness and preparedness. I think once they took hold of the situation and took stock of the situation, I think they have very swiftly restored normalcy, like it was apparent today. So yes, I think there are a lot of learnings from this particular untoward incidents yesterday. Very unfortunate, very sad. But I think the government has handled it fairly well today.
Let me bring you in at that point, Mr. Gundu Rao. You're getting a compliment for handling it well today, but that's after the trouble had happened. What Mrs. Shaw began by saying is that you were A, taken by surprise, and B, you were therefore unprepared. But the fact of the matter is, you knew that with the Supreme Court giving an order yesterday, there would have been possibility of trouble. And anyway, that trouble had been happening for 2-3 days previously. So why were you unprepared? Why were you taken by surprise? Except for the fact that you didn't take the proper advance measures necessary.
I think there are two reasons. One was on the 5th of September when Supreme Court came out with its orders. At that point of time, the government was successfully able to manage things, and even with the day of the Bandh, we were able to manage things. There were very few stray incidents, and even on the yesterday's judgment of the Supreme Court, I think the manner in which the judgment came out has really left us, in a state of complete shock, because it has completely gone against Karnataka's interests. And the request for the modification.
Mr. Gundu Rao, can I interrupt you there? You're giving me a history of what happened yesterday, and I appreciate your wanting to do that. But my question was about steps that you should have taken in advance of yesterday. After all, the trouble was brewing for 5 days before the Supreme Court order. Secondly, you would have, as a sensible government, anticipated that the Supreme Court order could be adverse. You have no reason to be confident it will be in your favor, and therefore, there were steps you should have taken to prepare for the worst. I'm asking a simple question. Did you, or did you fail to?
We did take a lot of steps in terms of, seeing that the police were deployed all across Bengaluru. But apart from that, the fact was the issue became explosive somewhere post-lunch, when rumor mongering and some media coverage also aggravated the whole situation. Something which happened in Tamil Nadu led to a retaliation over here. And most parts of Bengaluru were peaceful, except for a few areas, particularly in one area where the huge amount of trucks were burned down. That really was the one area where it really went bad. And there was
That's Haganhali.
Which suddenly became
That's
explosive.
Haganhali. I'll come to that in a moment's time. But let me go back to Mrs. Shaw to ask if she agrees with the point you're making, that you did take advanced steps. You were there in Bangalore, Mrs. Shaw. Do you believe that before the Supreme Court order, and this is critical, that before the Supreme Court order, the government had taken advanced steps anticipating there could be trouble?
Well, I think the way I would look at it is that, yes, as Mr. Gundu Rao said, the Bandh that we had on last Friday, didn't see too many untoward incidents that couldn't be controlled. And I guess they felt that when the adverse Supreme Court order came through, they perhaps thought that that was the kind of level of violence they would see. I think they were absolutely not expecting the kind of violence that happened on Mysore Road, especially that most unfortunate incident of burning down those buses, belonging to a private owner. And I think that's what finally made them realize that things were just beyond their control. And that's why I go back to the fact that yesterday was very, very unfortunate, very sad, very shocking. But I think I must say that today things have been restored to a sense of normalcy. I myself travelled into the city and things were fairly normal.
And Ram, let me bring you in at that point. First of all, I want to ask you how you respond to points that were made by various Karnataka politicians today that the trouble was initially sparked by violence A in Rameshwaram, which is in Tamil Nadu, and B by the petrol attack on the Woodlands Hotel in Chennai. Do you believe that is a credible explanation for the terrible scenes that we saw in Karnataka, or is this a bit like shifting the blame?
I'm afraid, Karan, that it is shifting the blame. It was to more or less divert attention from the seriousness, the depth of the violence that took place in Karnataka on that day. And I saw the letter from Chief Minister Siddaramaiah to Jaitley. It's been published, and I think he didn't quite get it at that point, but taking the cue from what Kiran said, I think it's commendable that just a day later, different attitude, different actions have shown that you could really bring it under control. So the lesson I would draw from this is we must be as constructive as possible, not raise the level of emotions and so on.
Sure.
But realize that
can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt and take you back to the point you made, that it is commendable that peace has been restored so comprehensively today? Doesn't that itself suggest that critical advanced steps that should have been taken yesterday in advance of the Supreme Court order weren't taken, that the government was caught unprepared because it hadn't taken the steps it should have taken? Then when it did respond, it managed to respond effectively, but today's calm and effectiveness actually underlines the irresponsible way they approached yesterday.
Yes, failure to take advanced steps is one thing. But also, if you have a foot in the other camp, that I also want this to be stopped, I don't like the Supreme Court order, therefore I join the agitators in that sense, and then try to protect law and order, maintain law and order, that's a very difficult thing. Today I'm glad, at least the early signs are the government has moved strategically in a direction that it will not tolerate this violence anymore.
Absolutely.
And it has also committed itself to obeying the order of the Supreme Court.
You're hinting there at the conspiracy theories that the government in some sense, in some shape and form, maybe not as a government but as individuals, was complicit. I'll come to that in a moment's time because I want very much to go into that. But first I want to go back to Mr. Gundu Rao. Mr. Gundu Rao, even after, and not just after, I'm saying even 6 to 7 hours after the Supreme Court order and 6 to 7 hours after your government formally declared Section 144, the worst violence was happening. The burning at Haganhalli of the vehicles and buses happened at 7 in the evening, which is some 6 hours after the Supreme Court order. So not only were you unprepared in terms of not taking advanced measures, but even after the Supreme Court order, you hadn't anticipated what could happen, and therefore the worst violence happened 7 hours after the order. Now that suggests that whatever steps you took after the Supreme Court order were ineffective. You only became effective somewhere around 10 at night.
Karan, yes, I admit the fact that things did go out of control because as soon as the order came out, it was a shocking order for us. And by the time we could understand the repercussions of this, things in a few places were happening, and I think the government wanted to take a little bit of a tolerant attitude towards the people who were agitating because it was, in a way, expressing their anguish. But I think in some places things did go out of control, and this particular area, what happened was the mob had gathered, they had cut off people from accessing the roads to these places, and even the police...
Can I interrupt you there? Mr. Gundu Rao, you said two very important things, which is why I'm interrupting you. First, you began by saying that the government was in shock. Governments ought not to be in shock. Only weak and helpless governments are in shock. Governments are there to respond to shocks and to respond to shocks effectively. But the second thing you said is even more important. You said the government began by taking a somewhat tolerant attitude to the violence and to the protesters. Now that's a bizarre thing. You're half suggesting that your sentiments were with them and you therefore didn't take effective action to stop them. Otherwise, what does this tolerance amount to?
Don't misrepresent me. We did take action, and in fact, at the end of it, we had to open fire, and a few people have died already, and that was the eventuality. So we were hoping to control it without allowing it to get violent. But things did go out of hand, I admit. But the government has come down with the iron hand today. We have assured the people that we will not allow this to happen. We'll protect the minorities, the Tamil linguistic minority.
Well, you definitely had to ensure the same thing didn't happen for a second day. Otherwise, you would have probably been dismissed as a government by the central government here. But let me pick up on that earlier point and go to Mr. Shaw. Mr. Shaw, you heard Mr. Gundu Rao say that initially the government deliberately took a tolerant attitude to the protesters. Now, many people are linking that with rumors and conspiracy theories swirling around your city today that politics and perhaps some within the Congress, perhaps some within the BJP were in some way complicit, not as governments and an opposition officially, but individuals. In other words, their politics played into the violence because they saw opportunities to help their cause. And in a sense, when Mr. Gundu Rao says that the government was initially tolerant, he seems to be half admitting it. How do you respond to those conspiracy theories? Because there are several of them in Bangalore today.
Well, I think it is a very emotive issue for everyone in Karnataka, and I guess, the government was a bit naive in thinking that there would just be a few minor stray incidents, but not expecting this level of violence. And I think that's what I meant, that they were not in a state of preparedness. They thought it would be of the same magnitude as they saw on the day of the Bandh last Friday. I don't think they expected this kind of violence where people would resort to burning 30 or 40 buses belonging to a private...
Mr. Shaw, what about that point Mr. Gundu Rao made about being tolerant? Because after all, by 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the scenes on television were deeply worrying, and at 7, you had that major violence in Haganhali. And that means at 4 and 5, when already the scenes were disturbing, the government was being tolerant rather than effectively stopping it.
No, I think that's where the sort of failure of being prepared is certainly showing up, and I think Mr. Gundu Rao has admitted that, largely saying that look, they expected the violence to be controlled, but they couldn't, and I think it went out of hand, it went out of control, and that's where I think the government has realized that this is something which they have to now clamp down on, and that's what you have seen today. The government has realized that this is not the way they can sort of manage the situation, and they've come down very, very effectively on this situation.
Let me very quickly bring you in on that, Ram, before I move to another subject. I know you're a Tamil, I know you're in Chennai, and therefore it's possible your sentiments will not be entirely on the side of the Karnataka government. But that apart, you're also a senior former editor-in-chief. And I want to ask you this, as you observe the situation, is this so-called tolerance, and I'm repeatedly using the word Mr. Gundu Rao used, in the initial stages understandable given the sentiments and the high feeling, or is it unforgivable because it suggests a certain attempt to use the problem as a weapon in the water war? Which of the two?
I would commend Mr. Gundu Rao for being frank and open about this, but I don't think it should be seen as something unforgivable, although the losses caused on that day, whether they could have been totally prevented, I don't know, were on a huge scale, including to the IT sector. But and Karnataka itself scored numerous own goals. But coming back to this, I think we have to look ahead and learning lessons from this, manage the situation.
Okay.
If the rain comes, the problem will dissolve. We've seen that before. This sort of thing happened 14 years ago in Karnataka.
And it's happened again.
Lessons were learned from it for a while, and then people forgot. People forgot about it.
I'll look ahead in a moment's time. I'm stopping you. I'll look ahead in a moment's time after the break, but for a while I want to still look backwards, because I think looking backwards also shows some credible lessons. I've got Mr. Gundu Rao now, not just on phone but on OB. Welcome to the program properly. It is good to have you, Mr. Gundu Rao. Let me ask you something that I think you may be more happy talking about. The trouble in Karnataka, as I said, was happening for 5 or 6 days before yesterday's Supreme Court order. Secondly, when the Supreme Court decided it was going to increase the amount of water that was given by some 42,000 cusecs, it must have known, or at least sensed, that it was potentially lighting a spark. Yet it dismissed this concern with the following grand pronouncement. When a court of law passes an order, it's the sacred duty of citizens to obey the same. Today, in the light of what happened, can questions be asked about the Supreme Court's order and behavior and attitude, or would it be unfair to do so?
Well, I think when we went to the Supreme Court requesting for some modification in the previous order, saying that the situation in Karnataka is very fragile and explosive, I think the Supreme Court should have either decided that this is not our expertise, there's already a supervisory committee, let them decide this and passed it on to them, or given some sort of another direction. But the language used by the Honorable Supreme Court has been very, very harsh, and it's come down very heavily on Karnataka. We are the aggrieved party, and the way that they have spoken, I think that's what has really caused a lot of pain to the people of Karnataka, that whatever our efforts, we are facing a very, very critical situation with hardly any water in our dams, and the Supreme Court has gone ahead and increased the allocation, and plus used such language that it has really put us in a very, very tight spot, and this order is very, very difficult to implement. It is really a very difficult order to implement, but we have the constitutional obligation is there, but on the ground it's a difficult order to implement for us. So it's like a hard, bitter pill to swallow for the people of Karnataka. Let
me bring in Mr. Gopal Hosur, a former, very senior Karnataka police officer. Welcome to the program, Mr. Hosur. The Supreme Court yesterday, both when it passed its order increasing the water by some 42,000 cusecs, and also in response to the Karnataka government's claim that they wanted the initial order rescinded because of potential law and order problems, the Supreme Court said, and I'm quoting, "When a court of law passes an order, it's the sacred duty of citizens to obey the same." And my question to you is this. Clearly, it's one thing to say that an individual or a small group of people must obey the Supreme Court. Enforcing an order on an individual or a small group is easy to do. But when an order upsets potentially tens of millions because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that this is going to affect their drinking water, it becomes a much more difficult thing to implement. Worse still, it becomes an order that could provoke them. Do you think the Supreme Court appreciated that?
To be very, very frank, law and order is not just law and enforcement. Law and order is a much bigger thing, especially when it involves emotions. Khabare issue has been a highly emotional issue for Karnataka, and there will be a tsunami of emotions. Merely the police action to control the law and order would definitely not be enough. I am sure the police would have tried to do their best.
But Mr. Hosur, you're slightly sidestepping my question. Give me a direct answer. Do you think the Supreme Court appreciated that this sort of order is difficult to implement when potentially tens of millions will be upset by it, rightly or wrongly, because they think it affects their drinking water? Do you think the Supreme Court appreciated the difficulty of implementing this order, or was the Supreme Court right to say grandly, when we pass an order, it's your sacred duty to accept and implement it?
I do not have the right credentials to comment on a Supreme Court order, but I am talking to you as a police officer of Karnataka, where I have seen a number of law and order situations connected with the Khabare issue and various other issues. When there is going to be a tsunami of emotions which is going to turn violent, it is extremely difficult, whether Supreme Court says or somebody else says, it is extremely difficult to implement those on the field.
Okay. Ram, I'm going to put that question to you. And I know it's a potentially difficult question, but it is a critical question, because whilst on the one hand it is right for the court to say that any order we give has to be implemented, it is also important for judges to bear in mind that an order that is interpreted to adversely affect not 1 or 2 or 100, but potentially tens of millions, could become very difficult to implement. And therefore, for the Supreme Court in those situations to say grandly it's the sacred duty of citizens to obey, becomes almost as if it's ignoring the problem and ignoring the dimension. Where do you come in on this?
You see, Karan, first on the substance of the order, I think what has been clear now and in earlier episodes when there were conflicting demands or positions is that you have to share surplus as well as distress, and it has to be done in an even-handed way. These are the principles. I've been involved in some discussions to resolve this on an amicable basis, going back a long way. But the Supreme Court, therefore, will take a stand if it says that deficits should also be shared in a difficult year. Then it's going to upset some people. But what the Supreme Court can do, and here I listened to Mr. Gundurov carefully and appreciatively, it can moderate or tone down the language. It should not appear harsh. It should appear to be sensitive. It should show sensitivity to those who may be in the wrong so far as your order is concerned, but who are likely to get upset.
And you're saying that sensitivity was missing in the Supreme Court's language? You're saying that sensitivity was missing in the Supreme Court's language?
No, I would say that it could have been more moderate. The comments could have been more moderate. Moderated in line with what was required in the situation. Yes, that's all I'm saying.
Particularly when you know that your order will affect and perhaps offend, if the word offend is correct, potentially tens of millions. Be sensitive about the way you word it, because you want it to be accepted rather than to become provocation for further violence. That's a very well made point. Let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to ask, what damage has this done to Bangalore, not just as a center of production and industry, but more importantly as the capital of India's Silicon Valley, and how easily may that damage be repaired, or how difficult may it be to do so. Welcome back. You're watching To The Point, and we're discussing yesterday's devastating violence in Bangalore. Kiran Mazumdar's show. Let's come to the damage this has done to Bangalore, and perhaps more importantly to its image. I'm not just talking about what the state has lost because of the Bandh and the violence, but what about the damage done to its international image as the capital of India's Silicon Valley?
Well, you know, Bangalore is a global city, and many global cities do, face these kind of very unfortunate incidents, and which can basically prove to be a sort of a taint in their reputation. But I think it is about swiftly restoring normalcy, and if you can do that, then you basically, your brand bounces back, so to speak. And I think in this particular respect, I think the government has done very well to make sure that they restored normalcy today and thereby salvaged any damage to Bangalore's brand value in terms of its international IT repute. So I think, they've done well. I think if it hadn't been brought under control, then we would have found it that much more difficult to allay certain fears and concerns expressed by various companies who are very heavily invested in this sector in Bangalore.
And Ram, the violence in Bangalore was not just devastating, but it coincides with 67 days of unrest and protest in Kashmir, which sadly is continuing, and now with heightened concern about dengue and chikungunya, and there have been allegedly 5 chikungunya deaths in Delhi in the last supposed 24 hours. Taken all together, is the image of India that's going to foreign investors whose FDI we badly need a rather unfortunate one suddenly?
Yes, I think Kashmir is a lot more serious, Karan, as you know very well, than any of the other issues. But yes, I think it's taken a hit, but there's nothing that can't be restored if you take the right action. Kashmir is going to take a long while because they've really blundered badly. That's of a different order of egregious conduct by the governments concerned and by some of the political parties concerned. But in the case of Bangalore, I think I'm confident that with this approach, with the approach we've seen today, with sense coming into the picture,
Okay.
I think we can, it will, as Kiran said, the brand can bounce back.
Mr. Gundurao, as you heard
has
Enram
bounced.
say, Kashmir is going to be a much more difficult problem for the government of India to tackle. But given that you have effectively restored calm so swiftly and promptly today, what steps now does your government propose to take to reassure investors that A, this will never happen again, and B, Bangalore remains a very inviting center for investment? What steps do you propose to take hereafter?
I think the first point was what was discussed today in morning with the Chief Minister and the senior leaders of the Congress, was that we have to ensure law and order at any cost. Let whatever happen tomorrow, whatever may be the verdict of the Supreme Court, or again on the 19th we have the Kaveri Supervisory Committee meeting. So let whatever may happen, but let us maintain law and order. Let's ensure that the minorities, the people from different parts of India living in Bangalore feel a sense of security. And that's what has happened today. Chief Minister has come out and given a very, very firm talk. The Home Minister also has gone around the city visiting places, and we will ensure that, because Bengaluru is an economic powerhouse and it's one of the most important cities of India. So it's our duty to see that there is a sense of security, and we have added on additional forces, and we are actually in the process of increasing the number of policing for Bangalore city. We're going to have more additional police forces on a permanent basis, and modernizing our police infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Bringing in all that we have to- that is the
Those
process
are
of
very
doing.
good. Those are
so
very
we
good
will-
points for your domestic audience. What about a foreign audience, the foreign investor? Amazon is extremely concerned. They've issued a statement today to say so. The American embassy yesterday issued an advisory to all its citizens. Perhaps other countries and other governments have done the same. What steps do you propose to take to assure those? I'll come to you in a moment's time, Mr. Shaw. I can see your hand. I'll just come to you. What steps do you propose to take to reassure those investors?
So I think they are looking at the way the government responds, and the way things are brought back to normalcy. And in the next, these things cannot just be reassured by talk. I think it has to be action on the ground, and the way the government goes about doing things. And I think in the next few weeks, if things are running as it was earlier and things are back to normalcy, I think all these people will feel a sense of reassurance. But definitely, as far as the talking part goes, we have already spoken about it, and we are putting things in place. So I can assure all of them that Bengaluru will get the priority, and we will ensure that these kind of incidents do not ever happen again, and we will not allow this kind of mob fury to take control in Bengaluru city.
Mr. Shaw, you had your finger up a moment ago. Go ahead. You wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted to say that, let's not single out Bangalore in this kind of a situation. I mean, you've seen how Atlanta, Paris, Marseille, and many other cities have gone through these kind of, very, very grave issues. And, all these cities have basically restored normalcy very swiftly, and thereby regained any damage or impact that it would have on travel advisories and such matters that you referred to. So I think Bangalore has done very well, and I think, as Mr. Gundurao says, if you can basically demonstrate that the government is capable of keeping its citizens and its properties safe, then I think no great damage would have been done.
Mr. Gopal Husur, one important part of tackling the problem that's happened and assuring investors both at home and abroad that it will never happen again would be accountability for those who mishandled it. To begin with, do heads need to roll in the police force? Because A, anticipation of the problem was missing, and B, for the first 6 hours, the steps that were taken were clearly inadequate, because the worst violence happened around 7 at night, a good 6-7 hours after the Supreme Court order and 6-7 hours after Section 144 was declared, which suggests the initial steps taken were also ineffective. So, do heads need to roll first in the police force?
I would like to make it very clear. Today, Bangalore has one of the finest police commissioners to, at least in the last couple of years that I have seen. He is businesslike, and he is very, very professional in his work. I am sure he has tried to build up the morale of the force and take action. But there are some things which go beyond the control of police, for which there are so many other issues responsible for it. The government on its part also tried to do its best, but since I mentioned it earlier, an emotional issue does not...
Mr. Hosur, let's not go down that road of mentioning what you mentioned earlier. Please stick to the question I asked, because we're running out of time. It's an important question, and I know as a police officer your sentiments would lie with the police, understandably, but nonetheless, given that they were ineffective in anticipating, and B, given that their initial steps were ineffective because the worst violence happened at 7 at night, 8 hours or 6 hours after the Supreme Court order, do heads need to roll? Please answer that.
I definitely say that there is no need for any head to roll, but there is a need for very serious introspection. The police morale has been quite low for quite some time in Karnataka. We had the police planning to go on a mass casual leave and an hesitation, somehow that was averted. So it is the duty of the government to ensure that the police are supported, their morale is built up. I am sure they will be able to contain such situations much better in the days to come. However, there is definitely a need to go back into what went wrong and why it went wrong and whether...
But then if there is a need to go back into what went wrong and why it went wrong, why do you say no heads need to roll? Why do you say introspection is needed but reiterate that no heads need to roll? Are you protecting your former colleagues or are you genuine when you say that?
No, I am not talking of that. You cannot get a police invented and suddenly manufactured from nowhere. You have to use the available existing police force. Merely making some head to roll doesn't solve this problem. And there have been the police commissioners in the past. There were similar incidents, not only in Bangalore, in many other parts of the city, and as Kiran rightly mentioned, in the world.
All right, sir. I take your point that merely making heads roll doesn't solve the problem, but equally when heads roll, it indicates that such lapses and mistakes will not be tolerated in future, and it ensures that subsequent generations behave more effectively and efficiently and take the right decisions. Accountability does mean that those who preside over mistakes must pay a price for them. Otherwise, you don't really achieve accountability, but you have your opinion and every right to it. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.